the police realized they were dealing with a calculated killer. They found a pattern: only officers connected to James's arrest were being targeted. The realization sent chills down their spines, and an internal investigation was launched. Now let's go back to how it all started. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. In the small town of Idik, life moved at its own rhythm. The marketplace bustled with traders calling out their wares. The smell of roasted yams and fried plantains filled the air, and children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing through the streets. Amidst this lively town lived James, a young man in his late 20s. Known for his hard work and calm demeanor, James was a carpenter who made beautiful furniture. But beneath his hardworking exterior, James carried a loneliness he couldn't shake. One market day, James headed to the town square, balancing a beautifully carved stool on his head. He hoped to sell it to a trader visiting from a distant village. As he made his way through the crowded paths, he collided with a woman carrying a basket of oranges. The stool fell to the ground, and oranges rolled in every direction. "I'm so sorry." James apologized, kneeling quickly to gather the scattered fruits. The woman smiled warmly, her brown eyes meeting his. "It's okay. It was an accident," she said, brushing dust off her wrapper. As they collected the oranges, James couldn't help but notice how graceful she was. "I'm James," he said shyly, handing her the last orange. "Sandra," she replied with a smile that made his heart skip. James offered to carry her basket, and they walked together to her store. Their conversation flowed easily, and by the time they reached her store, James was smitten. Sandra was not only beautiful but also intelligent and kind. She was from a neighboring village, selling fruits to support her younger siblings after their parents had passed away. From that day, James made excuses to visit the market just to see her. He brought her small gifts: a carved comb, a woven bracelet, and once, a basket of fresh fish. Sandra, in turn, would save her sweetest oranges for him. They often sat under the big baobab tree at the edge of the market, talking about their dreams. Months passed, and James realized he couldn't imagine a life without Sandra. One evening, under the soft glow of the moon, he knelt before her with a small carved box in his hands. Inside was a simple gold ring. "Sandra," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "will you make me the happiest man in Idik? Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes. "Yes, James. I will marry you." Their engagement became the talk of the town. Elders from both families met to finalize the bride price. James's family presented the traditional gifts: yam tubers, jars of palm wine, kola nuts, and a goat. Sandra's family accepted them, blessing the union. As the wedding day approached, the town buzzed with excitement. Women gathered to sing and saw Sandra's wedding attire, a bright blue wrapper with intricate patterns. James's friends helped him prepare a new home for his bride, painting the walls and arranging handmade furniture. The day before the wedding, James and Sandra exchanged heartfelt promises. "I will always protect you," James said, holding her hands. "And I will always stand by you," Sandra replied. James barely slept that night, excitement coursing through him. As dawn broke, he got on his bike to fetch supplies for the wedding. His heart was light, but he had no idea his life was about to change forever. The sun rose brightly over Idik, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. James was on his bike, humming a cheerful tune. He had a list of last-minute items he needed for the wedding: a bottle of palm wine for the elders, more vegetables for the feast, and kola nuts for the traditional ceremony. The road was dusty, lined with trees that swayed in the gentle morning breeze. As James pedaled through the quiet path leading to the market, his thoughts were filled with Sandra. He pictured her in her wedding attire, her radiant smile lighting up the day. He couldn't wait to say, "I do." As he approached the main road, his joy was interrupted by the sight of a police checkpoint. A line of officers stood in the middle of the road, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their stern faces gave no room for friendly banter. "Stop," one of the officers barked, raising a hand. James immediately slowed down, parking his bike by the side of the road. "Where are you going this early?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. "To the market," James replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need supplies for my wedding today." The officer raised an eyebrow, then gestured to his colleagues. Without warning, two officers approached James, grabbed his arms, and pinned him against the bike. "Hey! What's going on?" James exclaimed, panic creeping into his voice. "You're under arrest," one officer said coldly. "For what?" James shouted, struggling against their grip. "For the murder of the commissioner's son," the officer replied. James's heart stopped. "What? Murder? I don't even know the commissioner's son." The officers ignored his protest. One of them slammed handcuffs onto his wrist while another threw his bike into their truck. The villagers who witnessed the scene murmured in confusion. As the police van sped away, James's mind raced. Who had killed the commissioner's son? Why was he being blamed? What would happen to Sandra and their wedding? James was thrown into a dingy cell at the police station. The stench of sweat and decay filled the air, and the only light came from a small barred window. He spent the night pacing, his heart pounding with fear and frustration. The next day, he was taken to court. The room was filled with strangers, their eyes judging him. The commissioner sat in the front row, his face a mask of grief and anger. The prosecutor wasted no time painting a grim picture of James as a cold-blooded killer. Witnesses claimed they had seen him fleeing the scene of the crime. Evidence was presented, a knife with bloodstains, allegedly found near his workshop. "But I didn't do it," James shouted, standing up. "I've never even held a knife like that before." The judge silenced him with a stern glare. "You will speak when spoken to." James's family and Sandra sat at the back, tears streaming down their faces. Sandra tried to speak in his defense, but the court refused to hear her. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. "James, you have been found guilty of the murder of the commissioner's son. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison." James felt the world collapse around him. His knees buckled, and he was dragged out of the courtroom in chains. James was taken to Equilobia Maximum Prison, a grim fortress surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. Inside, the air was thick with despair. The guards were ruthless, and the inmates eyed him like vultures. His first few weeks were hell. He was beaten by inmates who wanted to assert their dominance. The food was barely edible, and the nights were filled with the sounds of screams and weeping. But James refused to break. He spent his days working in the prison workshop and his nights plotting ways to survive. He made a few allies, inmates who also claimed to be victims of injustice. Together, they shared stories of betrayal and pain, their camaraderie the only light in the darkness. Still, the thought of Sandra kept him going. He imagined her waiting for him, her love giving him the strength to endure. 15 years passed like a slow death. When James was finally released, his heart was heavy with a mix of hope and dread. He walked out of the prison gates, his body frail but his spirit burning with a desire for justice. Edic had changed. The streets were busier, the faces less familiar. He made his way to his family's house, but the joy of reunion was short-lived. His mother had passed away years ago, and his siblings had scattered to other towns. James's first thought was to find Sandra. He asked around, but the answers he received broke his heart. Sandra had waited for years, but when it became clear that James might never return, she had married another man and moved away. James felt something inside him snap. Everything he had cherished had been taken from him, his freedom, his family, and the love of his life. The injustice burned in his soul like a wildfire. He vowed to make those who had wronged him pay, starting with the men who had arrested him. James sat alone in his childhood home, staring at the cracked walls. Memories of his arrest replayed in his mind, how the officers had humiliated him, how they had laughed when he pleaded his innocence. He clenched his fist as a dark resolve grew within him. "I'll make them pay," he whispered to himself. The first step of his plan was to find out where the officers from his arrest were stationed. He began by visiting old friends and acquaintances, pretending to catch up while subtly steering the conversation toward the police. He would wake up drenched in sweat, fist clenched, muttering to himself, "I will make them pay." He began spending hours in silence, plotting his vengeance. His first step was to find the officers involved in his wrongful imprisonment. He remembered their faces vividly but needed their names and current locations. At a local tavern, he struck up conversations with old friends, disguising his true intentions. Pretending to be a man interested in joining the police force, he asked subtle questions. From snippets of gossip, he learned that Sergeant Bola, the officer who had humiliated him most, was now stationed in a nearby town. James's resolve hardened. Bola had been the one who smirked as he was dragged into the station, calling him a lowly criminal in front of the crowd. Bola would be his first target. For days, James shadowed Sergeant Bola, carefully observing his movements. He discovered that Bola lived alone in a modest bungalow and often walked home late from the station. On a rainy evening, James saw his opportunity. Dressed in dark clothes, he waited in an alley near Bola's house. The sergeant, oblivious to the danger, walked briskly, umbrella in hand. "Remember me, Sergeant Bola?" James hissed as he emerged from the shadows. Bola's eyes widened in recognition, but before he could react, James struck him with a crowbar. The strike was swift and brutal, leaving Bola motionless on the ground. James dragged the body into the alley, ensuring it wouldn't be discovered immediately. He stood over Bola's lifeless form, his heart pounding with adrenaline and a grim sense of justice. The discovery of Bola's body sent shockwaves through the local police force. Officers doubled their patrols, and checkpoints sprang up across the town. James knew he had to be more careful. He couldn't afford mistakes, but the fire of revenge burned brighter with every passing day. His next target was Inspector Andrew, the man who had taunted him during his trial. Andrew was known for his gambling habit, often frequenting a seedy casino on the outskirts of town. James watched Andrew for several nights, studying his routine. Finally, on a moonless night, he followed Andrew home. The inspector, slightly drunk, walked carelessly, humming to himself. James attacked swiftly, using a rope to strangle him. "Do you remember me now?" James whispered as Andrew gasped for air. The officer's body fell limp, and James fled into the darkness, leaving no trace of his presence. By now, the police realized they were dealing with a calculated killer. They found a pattern: only officers connected to James's arrest were being targeted. The realization sent chills down their spines, and an internal investigation was launched. James, however, was always one step ahead. He had learned the art of patience in prison, and he used it to his advantage. Disguising himself as a wandering laborer, he moved between towns, staying under the radar while continuing his mission. His third target was Corporal Matthew, a young officer who had mocked him during his first night in the cell. Matthew often stopped at a roadside bar after his shift. James waited for him one evening, his heart pounding with anticipation. As Matthew stumbled out of the bar, James followed him into a deserted alley. This time, the kill was messy. Matthew fought back, scratching James's arm before succumbing to the blade. The scratch Matthew left on James's arm became infected, forcing him to visit a local herbalist. The woman, suspicious of his injury, asked too many questions, but James deflected them with vague answers. Meanwhile, the police intensified their search. They set up roadblocks and interrogated locals, but James's careful planning kept him hidden. However, he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The walls were closing in. James continued his spree, targeting officers in different towns. Each kill brought him closer to closure but also increased the risk of capture. The police were closing in, piecing together fragments of evidence and witness accounts. His methods became more daring, ambushing an officer on a remote road, poisoning another's drink, and even setting a trap that led to a car explosion. Each kill was personal, a calculated move in his quest for vengeance. But with every strike, James felt the weight of his actions. He began to question himself, wondering if his revenge would ever bring him peace. The police devised a plan to lure James out. They spread false information about a gathering of officers in a remote village, knowing he wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity. James, desperate to complete his mission, took the bait. As he approached the location, he sensed something was off. The silence was too perfect, the shadows too still. Before he could retreat, armed officers surrounded him. "It's over, James," one of them shouted. James fought fiercely, his survival instincts kicking in. He managed to injure 2 officers before they overpowered him. Handcuffed and bloodied, he was dragged to the station, his defiance shining through his battered face. "You think this is justice?" he spat. "You created me." James's trial was a spectacle, drawing crowds from far and wide. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and witnesses recounted his crimes in chilling detail. When asked why he had committed the murders, James's voice was steady. "You took everything from me, my freedom, my future, my love. I only returned the favor." The judge's verdict was swift: life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some condemning James, others sympathizing with his plight. As James was led away, he caught a glimpse of Amora's parents in the crowd. Their faces were a mixture of anger and sorrow, a mirror of the emotions that churned within him. Back in prison, James became a ghost of his former self. He spent his days in silence, replaying the events that had led him to this point. He thought of Amora, of the life they could have had, and of the choices that had sealed his fate. In the end, James's story became a cautionary tale in Edic, a grim reminder of how injustice can breed monsters and how vengeance can consume a man's soul. Thank you for watching till the end. What is your take on this story? Please tell us in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to get the latest stories and updates. As e dey hot.